My parents decided they had enough of me at 8 years old. Looking back, I cannot say I blame them. When I was born, they were young, just in their 20s, and I watched them try to raise me and make a life. Though I didn't know it back then, I suppose that's where the bitterness first began. All I knew was that I didn't appear to appeal, really. Years of attempting to win them over and earn their love came back empty-handed. Emotionally neglected, I was ignored unless we were among other people. Then they would perform, all smiles and friendliness, and threaten me into silence on the realities at home. I played along as I wanted things not to get worse. Neglect on this continual basis had consequences. My grades dropped, and I started to cause actual trouble in class. Though negative, acting out was the only way I could grab their attention. But when my mother fell pregnant once more, my scheme fell apart very embarrassingly. Declaring it at my 8th birthday celebration, they were overjoyed. I couldn't understand what that meant for me. A few weeks later, I saw my mother packing my things and knew the answer. Dad sat me down and explained I wasn't doing well, and they wanted the best for me. Hence, I was being moved to live with my aunt. I wasn't naive, knowing they were replacing me and eliminating me now that they were expecting a new child. I promised to be better, then started to act out and begged to stay. Still, they were not really interested. Without second thinking, they sent me out of state to my aunt's house. I was depressed even on the way. I begged them, but their thoughts were set in stone. That maybe it wasn't about my academics or behavior at all hadn't occurred to me then. Maybe they would have objected to me anyhow. Part 2. Comforts from Aunt Clara. Clara, my aunt, was my dad's older sister. She was the most lovely, gentle person I have ever come across. Living on the family farm after all her siblings had moved on, she never married and had no children of her own. Sensing my discomfort, she greeted me with wide arms. She told me everything would be okay and that I would come to love the farm. She was correct as well. I fell apart when my parents departed. There for me, Aunt Clara comforted me while my parents hardly responded to her calls. Though Aunt Clara never wavered, I grieved for weeks. I began to heal slowly. I stopped totally missing my parents a few months later. Living on the farm was quiet and contented. I went to school, assisted with housework, and even had friends. My marks got better, and the teachers seemed to enjoy me. It was weird. The moment I was sent off, my life started to improve. Though I knew I would be better off without them, I saw my parents on holidays. Thanking Aunt Clara for bringing me in, I told her how they treated me. Her attitude toward them then altered to become colder, more remote. Occasionally we saw them at family gatherings, but there was minimal interaction. I was happier without them in my life. They seemed not to give a damn about how I was doing. Third part, the phone call that turned everything around. 12 years later, now in college, I was learning business, so I might inherit the farm when Aunt Clara became older. Most weekends, I returned home loving the close access to the farm and the life I had created. Then out of the blue, my folks phoned. Not having my number, they had approached Aunt Clara. 12 years of silence later, I was on the phone with them. They began by remarking on how well I was doing and on their pride in me. Then arrived the bombshell. They wanted me to get back in touch with them and return home after graduation. Another chance at parenting. I looked shocked. Why now, after all these years? They said it had to do with my sister Lily. She apparently was humiliating for them and more of a problem child than I had heard. They wanted me returned to show everyone they could produce decent children. That was a ludicrous excuse. They wanted me as a prop to help them to rebuild their credibility. I told them straight out I wasn't returning. I wouldn't be helping them prove anything. I had nothing to do with them, thus they had nothing to do with me. Their tantrums over how they had supported Aunt Clara and me over all these years. But their support was a pitiful monthly check barely covering anything. Out of her own pocket, Aunt Clara paid for most of my bills. They grumbled about Lily's failure and about me having to assist them. I went crazy at that. I told them I no longer even considered them family, and they were nothing like my parents. They had to leave Aunt Clara and myself by ourselves. My family consisted just of her. Part 4. Reddit support and the afterglow. Uncertain if I would have overreacted, I shared on Reddit about the whole event. The answer came out as overwhelming. People told me my parents were out of line, and I was not the asshole. It allowed one to see things in context. My parents kept bothering me, texting from separate phones, attempting to guilt me back off. Though I blocked them everywhere, they persisted. Aunt Clara advised me not to feel guilty about it. She told me to disregard them. She had talked to other family members. attempting to comprehend my parents' apparent urgency to validate their parenting abilities. As it happened, Lily had been caught smoking during her 12th birthday celebration. She started to cry as my parents tried to take the cigarette away. Other relatives had blasted them out on their lack of parenting, claiming Lily even had access to smokes. It was their responsibility. They never said no to anything. They had spoiled her rotten. She could do with her exorbitant allowance whatever she chose. Their reputation had suffered from the cigarette episode. Thus, they were now eager to show they were not bad parents. They wanted me to be a prize kid shown about. It was pitiful. Worse, they realized their scheme was useless. Everybody understood Aunt Clara raised me. They were unable to rewrite history. I became depressed for Lily. She was a little child needing direction, not a tool in her parents' disorganized game. Part 5. Confrontation and More Truths. When my parents phoned once more, this time demanding an explanation and reminding me I owed it to them to get home, already in a foul temper, their call drove me over the line. Screaming, I informed them they hadn't earned the title, and they weren't my parents. My entire life they had ignored me. Aunt Clara was my family, if anybody else was. For my emotions, they had no one to answer, except themselves. They broke off to mention the support they had given. I told them that Aunt Clara had paid for most of my schooling, and that their money hardly covered anything. They had to pay child support anyway. Hence, they had to stop acting as though they were doing us a favor. From Lily's smoking episode, they should have understood that money wasn't everything. It was backfiring. They were indulging her exactly as they had neglected me. Their concerns were appearances, not with regard to genuine parenting. Screaming and cursing me, they said I didn't know what I was talking about. But their defensiveness merely validated what I had said. We fought, and at last, they admitted they were delighted Lily had been sent away instead of them. Thinking they would hurt me, they hung up. But I gave no thought at all, simply said, I was happy I had confronted them. I was terrible for Lily, caught in that poisonous surroundings. Given a fair chance, I believed she might flourish. Part 6. Lily's justice years went by, not bothered once more by my parents. Although they sought to minimize the cigarette incident, nobody was misled. People could see through their lies. At last, Aunt Clara began to tell people the truth about the reason they had taken me abroad. She had kept quiet for years in order to uphold their name, but now she believed they deserved the fallout from their deeds. On Mom's side, my grandparents phoned, wanting the truth. They had heard tales about how my parents treated me. I covered everything with them. Realizing their daughter and son-in-law had no excuse for sending me away, they were horrified. Driven to shield Lily from the same fate I had endured, they resolved to battle for custody of her. Lily seemed apathetic to the temporary custody they acquired. She would come to see it was better with time, I knew. The nicest thing was Lily began contacting me. She seemed delighted to have someone to connect with when we spoke on the phone. Her parents had banned her from communicating with me, but now she could establish rapport with her brother. I carried hope. Perhaps after all this, something positive would result. Perhaps Lily and I might have the sibling relationship we were denied for so long. And perhaps, just maybe, my parents would at last pay for their deeds and come to see the devastation they had done. Older sister of Dad, Aunt Clara, led a quiet existence. Never married, without children of her own, she stayed on the family farm after all her siblings, including my dad, had migrated to pursue their aspirations in the city. She stood out, have always been, a loving soul with eyes that saw things without your words needing to be spoken. I was a storm cloud of grief and resentment when they took me to her. I knew what being undesired felt like even at 8, but Aunt Clara merely nodded, as she knew. She moved like the ancient oak tree in the paddock, cool and consistent. She gave me security. Maybe this wouldn't be as horrible. Spending a few days, my folks fidgeted about attempting to seem like they cared. Still, their sights were already somewhere else, back in the city with their ideal new family. The dam cracked when they at last left. I cried until I felt I would run out. Aunt Clara simply sat with me, like she had all the time in the world. She didn't try to buck up or be a man like my dad would have, or solve it with words. She merely let me feel it, let me be cracked, and gradually, the warmth of her compassion began to melt the ice surrounding my heart, just as the sun does. On the farm, life was basic. Our alarm clock was the rooster. We woke with the sunrise. There were never-ending chores ranging from managing the garden to feeding the hens and getting eggs. Still, there was a rhythm to it, a goal I had not before understood. I learned about the land from Aunt Clara, about listening to the wind, about coaxing life out of the ground. We seeded, saw them grow, and cared for them till they produced fruit. I participated in what seemed to be a miracle. Schools were different here as well, smaller, quieter. The lecturers grinned more and had time to address my queries. We explored the fields, built forts in the hayloft, and swam in the creek on hot summer days. I befriended true friends who didn't give a damn about my parents not wanting me. That was an unusual sort of magic. I felt better the farther away my parents were from each other. The wrath subsided to a silence I had never known. I watched my parents on holidays, forced graces, and awkward talks, but it resembled staring at strangers. They were shadows, losing with every season that went by. I told Aunt Clara all in one day, about the neglect, the sense of burden, the way they handled me as something they had to hide. She listened, her eyes reflecting a melancholy I could not have then understood. She did not, however, criticize them or offer a negative review. I knew I was at last home. She simply embraced me closer. After that, things changed. Respectful always, Aunt Clara now kept her distance from my parents. She answered their calls with courteous coolness, her warmth saved for me. It was as though she was shielding me from their toxic apathy. At family get-togethers, Christmas, Thanksgiving, we still saw them. For them, though, I was a ghost, a faded picture in a dusty album, and I approved of that as well. With Aunt Clara, with the farm, the ground under my feet, and the heavens above my head, I had discovered a real love, a belonging that transcended mere blood. 12 years elapsed like the change of seasons, spring planting to summer harvest, fall foliage through winter snows, calloused hands and sun-kissed skin for 12 years. Learning the language of the country for 12 years, one gains the earth's patience. 12 years of really free existence. Now, just a short drive from the farm, I was at college. Learning business, Aunt Clara remarked, would help me to make this old place sing after she was gone. Most weekends, I returned home carrying the aroma of books and city streets, but the farm always drew me back. Its calm strength was like a healing agent for my spirit. Then one cool fall evening the phone rang. Aunt Clara answered, listening and wrinkling her brow. Her voice tense, she passed me the receiver. "It's your father, my dad." A term with greater meaninglessness than dust. I hadn't wanted to and hadn't spoken to him in years, but here he was, his voice blazing across the cables, a phantom returning to torment me. He began with polite conversation, the clumsy fumbling of a stranger. How was education? The farm was in what condition? Then, the actual cause of his call. They requested that I be back. "We want to be a family again," he added, his voice choked with forced feeling. "We want things right. We were wrong to send you away." I nearly giggled. Correct things here? 12 years later now? After forsaking me like a stray dog? What had evolved? He stammered with the response. "It was Lily, my sister, the one they substituted for me. She was troubled," he added, "a difficult child. They needed me to return to demonstrate to everyone they weren't failures as parents." The terms strike me like a slap. Not truly. They did not want me. They needed a prop, a shining example to hide their errors. They wanted me to preserve face. "You don't get to do that," I cried, my voice trembling as anger, hot and sharp, shot through me. "You made your choice. You do not get to toss me away and then come back years later seeking a do-over." He tried to argue, rumbling about how they had supported me over all these years, helped me out, with their pitiful checks that hardly paid for my food. Aunt Clara had given her life and soul to raise me. They hadn't done a darn thing. She had sacrificed everything. "You want to talk about support?" I laughed. "You want to talk about family? Aunt Clara is my family. You're just strangers who share some of my blood." The stillness on the other side was weighty, trying to find a means of controlling me, guilt me into submission. I could practically hear the wheels churning in his head, but I was overdone. I said, my voice flat, "Leave us alone. You had your chance and blew it. I owe you nothing." With palms shaking, I hung up the phone. Though they had come knocking, the spirits of the past had not located the terrified small child they had left behind. They had discovered a man grounded and powerful with a love for his actual family, blazing more than any bitterness. My father's call rocked me, as though a hurricane had gone across my soul. I told Aunt Clara everything. The hurt and resentment erupted like a flood. She listened, her face wrinkled with concern. but her eyes flicked with something else, a fire I had not seen before. "It's time," she murmured, her voice calm but forceful. Time they knew the truth. I didn't understand. Truth what? Always so quiet and reluctant to talk negatively of anyone, Aunt Clara was ready to battle. "They want to use you, nephew," she said, her voice tinged with an uncommon rage. "They want to paint themselves as heroes, and you as the troubled child they saved. But that's not the story of your life, and it's not the story I'll let them tell." Aunt Clara began phoning throughout the next several days, to relatives, to old acquaintances, to everybody who would listen. She talked of my parents' negligence, their desertion, their abrupt need to recover me for their own self-serving needs. Word got out like wildfire. Whispers on the breeze brought the truth right into each member of our extended family. Those who had earlier complimented my parents for their sacrifice now viewed them warily. The facade was falling apart. Aunt Clara also became better acquainted with Lily, my sister. She had not only once, but multiple times been caught smoking. She was running with a tough group and skipping class, blinded by their own urge to seem ideal. My parents had disregarded the warning signals. "They did the same with you," Aunt Clara replied. Her voice weighed with grief. "They ignored you, hoping you'd vanish, and when you acted out, they blamed you, not themselves." I became quite sympathetic to Lily. Like I had been, she was a victim of my parents' incapacity to really love and to really parent. Their obsession with looks and what others thought blinded them to the harm they were doing to their own children. Once lurking in the darkness, the truth was now on show. Confronted with their lies, my parents were defensive and attacked everyone who dared challenge them. Though they were snarling and spitting like caged animals, their strength was dwindling. Away from the drama, I concentrated on the farm and my studies, but the murmurs reached me, bearing tales of my parents' collapse. Their friends were pulling away, their reputation damaged, alone, cut off by their own dishonesty. And I sensed justice in the peace of the farm under the wary eye of the sky, not the kind seeking retribution, but the kind bringing equilibrium. That says, you cannot hurt others without consequence. The earth kept me firm while the wind carried the murmurs. I was no more a thrown-away son, a forgotten youngster, rooted in reality, a guy surrounded by affection, and my parents could never have taken that away. The whispers became murmurs, and the murmurs direct accusations. Once pillars of their town, my parents were now shunners. Their painstakingly built front had collapsed to expose the rot under. Denying everything, they sought to rebel by blaming others. But the truth could no more be controlled than a river breaking its banks. It passed through the family, cleansing years of dishonesty and denial. One day the storm came right up to me, calling. My mother's voice was sharp with desperation. She urged me to help them fix this mess. She said, tears tinged with a false regret, "We need you. We made a mistake. We know that now. But if you just give us a chance, we can be a family once more." I listened, heart stiffening with every syllable. Not essentially. They did not want me. They sought a weapon, a shield to help to assign the guilt. Like they had always done, they intended to utilize me. "You don't get to do this," I responded, my voice cool and steady. "You do not get to abandon me, neglect me, and then expect me to come running when you need something." Sharp as flint, my comments touched a nerve. The bitterness my mother had always kept buried crept into her voice. She spouted, "You ungrateful child. We sacrificed so much for you, and you throw it back in our faces. We gave you everything, and this is how you pay us? Giving up? Whose sacrifice? They had only brought me suffering and neglect. The one who had given me a house, a life, and a love they were unable of, was Aunt Clara. She had given up something. "You know nothing about sacrifice," I said, my voice growing in ferocity. "Aunt Clara sacrificed. She took me in, loved me, raised me when you didn't want me. She's the only parent I've ever known." On the opposite side, the quiet was intolerable, trying to find a way to twist my words, thereby making me the villain in this tale. I could practically hear the wheels turning in my mother's head, but I refused to let her. "You want to talk about sacrifices?" I said, now sounding like thunder. "You threw me away so you could focus on your perfect small family, and look what it got you. You sacrificed me for Lily." I shared with her Lily's problems, smoking, defiance. As I told her, their indifference had poisoned their own daughter, as it had done me. The voice of my mother fractured. She whimpered, "She's just a child. She needs our help, our direction. And what about me? I murmured, the words ringing in the stillness. Did I not need your help? Did I not need your guiding? Nobody answered, just the ragged sound of my mother's remorse and regret-filled breathing. It's too late, I murmured, sounding gently sad. You had your chance, and you wasted it. Now you have to deal with the results of your activities. Years of hidden rage, hurt, and hatred spilled out as I hung up the phone, the storm finally bursting inside me. She left me tired but oddly freed. The truth had spoken. The masks have been thrown aside, and I knew I was at last free in the calm after. A brittle peace crept over the country following the storm. With the weight of their own transgressions silencing their words, my parents withdrew and licked their wounds. The voices vanished, and a peaceful awareness took front stage. People knew the truth. That was plenty. Ever the lighthouse of peace, Aunt Clara kept our small family intact. She raised the farm and me with relentless love. Once more, life found its rhythm. The days were occupied with the familiar comfort of chores and the peaceful company of the earth. Still, change was blowing in the air. My mother's parents, my grandparents, contacted one another. They sensed the water changing and heard the murmurs. They wanted to know the grandson they had inadvertently lost. I spoke with them with a transparency I hadn't thought I could have. I shared with them my early years, the neglect, the abandonment, the great suffering of unwanted feeling. They listened, their souls weighed with a loss that reflected mine. We were blind, my grandfather said, his voice loaded with remorse. We trusted our daughter. We never would have imagined she could be so cruel. Now, they could see the truth, the profound marks left by my parents' behavior. They also witnessed something else, the love, fortitude, and strength blossoming in the rich ground of Aunt Clara's care. They contacted Lily, their granddaughter lost among the ruins of my parents' mistakes. They gave her a secure refuge, a place to recover, and an opportunity to flourish free from the poison of neglect and unmet expectations. At first reluctant, Lily resembled a wounded deer gradually blossoming. She explored a world outside my parents' warped reality on weekends with my grandparents. She came to enjoy the small joys and the cohesiveness of unqualified affection. She then contacted me, a timid offer to visit, a hesitant phone conversation. Two siblings driven by a need for connection and shared trauma met here. We discussed dreams, hopes, and the uncertain future that lay ahead, not about the past. Like a vine straggling for the sun, a delicate link started to grow. Though strangers, sure, we were strangers with a common knowledge that transcended mere blood. Initiating the legal process were my grandparents, whose knowledge came from years of grief and experience. Not to punish my parents, but rather to guard Lily, they sought custody of her. Recognizing the reality of the circumstances, the courts granted their demand. Lily flourished under their guidance. Learning delighted her. She uncovered latent skills, and she started to mend from the hurts our parents caused. She was a young lady with a voice, a spirit, and a destiny of her own creating, not a piece in their game. I would also sit on the porch with Aunt Clara in the calm evenings as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars emerged to adorn the night sky. Lily running over the fields, her laughter carried on the soft air. The healing winds of change had carried away the trash of the past, leaving behind a rich ground for love, forgiveness, and the continuing power of family. The family we selected, the family that really counted.